The golden hues of sunset reflected off Manhattan's towering skyscrapers as Ethan Walker stood casually against his Ferrari, scanning the crowd outside New York University's Grand Reception Hall. As the only son of William Walker, one of the most influential real estate moguls in the country, Ethan had spent his life surrounded by power and privilege. His crisp Ralph Lauren shirt, casually rolled-up sleeves, and gleaming Patek Philippe on his wrist were effortless signals of his elite status. He didn't chase attention. It came to him naturally. Tonight was NYU's exclusive welcome gala, a gathering of the city's wealthiest and most influential young minds. Crystal chandeliers illuminated the lavish ballroom, where laughter and the clinking of champagne glasses filled the air. Ethan moved through the space with the ease of a king surveying his court. Assured, untouchable, and fully aware of his place in this world. Then, the grand doors swung open, and Aurora Sullivan stepped in. No shimmering gown, no diamond accessories, just a simple beige cotton dress, her dark hair neatly tied back. In a sea of luxury and extravagance, she stood out like an anomaly, yet there was an undeniable poise about her, a quiet confidence that made her presence impossible to ignore. Aurora was no ordinary girl. She was the daughter of Richard Sullivan, the visionary founder of Sullivan Agritech, a company revolutionizing sustainable farming worldwide. Unlike most heirs born into fortune, Aurora had spent her youth studying hydroponic systems, analyzing supply chains, and attending board meetings. To her, wealth wasn't a privilege, it was a responsibility, one she intended to wield with purpose. Ethan arched an eyebrow as his gaze settled on her, a smirk tugging at the corner of his lips. "A farm girl?" he muttered to Nathan Cole, his ever-present companion. Nathan followed his gaze before chuckling. "Definitely not the kind of heiress we usually see at these events." Aurora didn't need to turn around to feel the weight of their stares. She had lived her entire life being scrutinized by those who mistook simplicity for insignificance. But their opinions didn't matter. She wasn't here to impress anyone. She was here to forge her own path. Ethan Walker wasn't used to being summoned. He was the one who dictated terms, the one who held control. But when his father, William Walker, a man whose words carried the weight of entire financial empires, called him into his office, Ethan knew it wasn't a request. William's office occupied the top floor of Walker Enterprises, a towering empire of wealth and influence. As Ethan entered, his father stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing down at the city as if it were a chessboard he could manipulate at will. "Sit down, Ethan." The older man's voice was calm, measured. Ethan crossed his arms, but took the seat nonetheless. "You're 25 years old, and you've contributed nothing of value. You spend, you indulge, but you've never built anything." Ethan smirked. "If you called me here just to lecture me—" "I'm not lecturing, I'm giving you a choice." William turned, placing a thick folder on the desk. "You will marry Aurora Sullivan." Ethan blinked. "Excuse me?" "Richard Sullivan and I have agreed. Our families will unite through this marriage. This isn't just an arrangement, it's an opportunity. But you do have a choice." William's gaze hardened. "If you refuse, I will freeze all your assets. No penthouse, no cars, no accounts. You will make your own way in the world without a single cent from the Walker name." Silence stretched between them, heavy and suffocating. Ethan let out a dry laugh, but beneath his bravado, unease crawled up his spine. "You can't be serious. This isn't the 1800s. You can't just arrange my marriage like I'm some pawn in a merger." "I'm not forcing you," William's voice remained steady. "I'm simply removing your dependence on me. If you believe you can stand on your own, walk out of here now." Ethan clenched his jaw, his eyes flickering to the contract on the desk. An arranged marriage or complete exile. He despised being backed into a corner, but he wasn't foolish enough to throw away the life he knew. Days later, he sat across from Aurora Sullivan at an exclusive restaurant. Unlike him, she didn't seem surprised. She had clearly known about this arrangement long before he had. "You knew about this?" Ethan asked, his tone laced with dry amusement. Aurora took a sip of her wine before answering. "Of course. My father has always had grander plans for me." "And you agreed to this?" "With conditions." She set down her glass, meeting his gaze with unwavering composure. "I have no use for a husband who contributes nothing. If you want to keep your privileged life, you'll have to prove yourself in 6 months by working at Sullivan Agritech. If not, we divorce. Simple." Ethan chuckled, leaning in slightly. "And you'll be the one judging whether I pass or fail?" Aurora didn't flinch. "I don't have time to judge anyone, Ethan. You'll either prove your worth or you won't." And with that, the game had officially begun. New York had never seen a more extravagant wedding. St. Patrick's Cathedral gleamed under the glow of crystal chandeliers, its towering stained glass windows bearing silent witness to a union built not on love, but on power. Billionaires, politicians, and high-profile figures gathered, raising their glasses in celebration of a marriage that everyone understood was nothing more than a business transaction. Ethan Walker stood at the altar, a vision of effortless perfection in his tailored tuxedo, yet his expression was unreadable. Beside him, Aurora Sullivan approached in a gown that defied convention, not overly elaborate, yet carrying an undeniable air of quiet regality. She didn't tremble. She didn't hesitate. "I suppose this is where I say I do," Ethan murmured, his smirk barely concealing his indifference as the priest turned to him expectantly. Aurora didn't spare him a glance. "Let's just get this over with." Their ceremonial kiss was brief, met with thunderous applause and beaming smiles from their guests. But between them, there was nothing but a hollow void. That night, in the penthouse suite of one of Manhattan's most luxurious hotels, reality settled in. Ethan shrugged off his suit jacket, leaning casually against the desk, arms crossed over his chest. His voice was devoid of warmth. "I won't touch you, and will end this the moment the contract allows." Aurora showed no reaction. Instead, she reached into her bag, retrieved a set of papers, and placed them on the table with quiet finality. "Then prove it." As the city lights flickered beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, they stood in silence. Bound by a contract, yet separated by an abyss neither had any intention of crossing. Ethan Walker had always belonged to Manhattan, the towering skyscrapers, the extravagant parties, the streets that never slept. But now he sat in the back of a dusty SUV, watching as the scenery morphed into something entirely foreign. The glittering cityscape faded behind him, replaced by endless fields and open skies. Texas. Sullivan Agritech wasn't just a farm. It was a high-tech agricultural research center, where AI managed irrigation systems, optimized water usage, where scientists engineered drought-resistant crops, where innovation was as essential as sunlight. But to Ethan, it felt more like exile. The SUV pulled up to a large wooden house overlooking the sprawling complex. Standing on the porch, arms crossed over her chest, Aurora Sullivan waited. "Welcome to my world, Ethan," she said, her tone unreadable. He stepped out of the car, inhaling deeply. Gone were the marble floors, the vintage wines, the thumping bass of underground clubs. Here, there was only earth, wind, and a life he didn't understand. The first few days were nothing short of hell. Ethan had never worked a real day in his life, but here he wasn't Ethan Walker, heir to a billion-dollar empire. He was just another clueless outsider in a world that demanded competence. He tried assisting a group of engineers with the irrigation system, but accidentally overloaded the pressure sensors, flooding an entire section of the field. Another morning, he attempted to operate an autonomous tractor, but nearly crashed the system's navigation controls. A city boy trying to be a farmer, that's a first. One of the technicians smirked as Ethan fumbled with the control panel. Ethan gritted his teeth but couldn't argue. They weren't wrong. Here, he was nothing. Aurora watched but offered no assistance. She didn't defend him, didn't correct his mistakes. If Ethan wanted to prove himself, he would have to do it alone. That night, as the field stretched into darkness, Ethan stood alone on the porch, the wind carrying the distant hum of automated machinery. A part of him wanted to quit, to book the first flight back to New York. But another part, one he barely recognized, told him he couldn't walk away like a failure. For the first time in his life, Ethan Walker had to start from nothing. Ethan Walker had never imagined himself caring about agriculture. But after days of relentless failure and condescending stares, something inside him began to shift. At first, it was pride. He couldn't stand being seen as incompetent. Then, it became curiosity. He started paying attention. Instead of mindlessly following orders, he listened as engineers discussed how the AI-controlled irrigation system adjusted water levels based on real-time soil data. He began to understand why each seed was meticulously selected, why Sullivan Agritech wasn't just a farm, but a mission. Under the Texas sun, he started learning. He learned to operate the monitoring systems, to distinguish between different crop strains, even to tweak the irrigation algorithms for one of the experimental fields. His hands, once accustomed only to gripping the wheel of a luxury car or holding a glass of top-shelf whiskey, were now streaked with dirt and machine oil. And in the midst of it all, he began to see Aurora differently. Before, he had only seen her as proud, distant, and impossible to impress. But now, he realized she wasn't just intelligent. She was deeply dedicated in a way he had never encountered before. She wasn't someone who merely sat behind a desk and issued orders. She was out in the fields before sunrise, personally inspecting experimental plots, double-checking data instead of relying on reports. Some nights he caught glimpses of her working late, poring over climate change research and its impact on agriculture, while he had never considered anything beyond his own interests. Ethan couldn't deny it. He was beginning to admire her. One night, as Ethan was reviewing surveillance data out in the field, he spotted Aurora under the glow of a work lamp, meticulously taking notes. For the first time, instead of avoiding her or exchanging sharp remarks, he sat across from her. "Why did you agree to this marriage?" Ethan asked, his voice low, stripped of its usual sarcasm. Aurora paused, looking up from her notes. Her eyes, illuminated by the soft Texas night, were calm, yet unwavering. "Because I believe people can change." Her words were simple, but they lingered in the air between them, heavier than anything she could have said. Ethan said nothing in response, because for the first time, he wondered if he really was changing. 6 months ago, Ethan Walker arrived in Texas feeling like an exile, forced into a marriage without love, thrown into a world he didn't understand. But now, as he stood in the middle of vast golden fields under the setting sun, he knew he wasn't the same man anymore. Ethan was no longer the spoiled heir who only cared about fast cars and endless parties. Now, he could look at a field and understand how much water it needed, whether the soil was rich enough, and which crops would survive the next drought. He wasn't just working at Sullivan Agritech, he cared about the mission. But now he stood at a crossroads. That evening, as he finished analyzing data on a new rice strain, his phone buzzed. A name flashed across the screen. The man who hadn't contacted him in 6 months. William Walker. "Ethan," his father's deep voice came through, "it's time for you to come home." Ethan didn't respond. "Everything is arranged. You'll return to New York, take your position as vice president at Walker Enterprises. Your penthouse is waiting. Your bank accounts are reinstated. All you have to do is leave Texas." Everything he once thought he couldn't live without suddenly felt meaningless. He looked out the window. In the distance, Aurora was kneeling in the dirt, examining a soil sample, her hair tangled in the wind. But she didn't care. She had never cared about appearances, only about the work, about what she believed in. And that was when Ethan realized he didn't want to leave. New York had been his world, but this was home now. And the woman standing out there, she was the one thing he couldn't walk away from. "I'm not coming back, Dad," Ethan said firmly. "I've found my place here." And for the first time in his life, he chose what truly mattered. Ethan had never been the kind of man who believed in grand romantic gestures, but tonight, under the vast Texas sky, surrounded by endless fields, he knew this was the moment. He had once said, "I do," before hundreds of high-profile guests in a cathedral adorned with gold and marble. But that wasn't his choice. Tonight, in the quiet embrace of open land and the whisper of the wind, he wanted to choose for himself. Aurora stood before him, bathed in moonlight. She was still the same, strong, independent, unwavering in her convictions. But Ethan knew now, being with her wasn't about obligation. It was about finding where he truly belonged. He stepped closer, taking her hands in his. "This time, I'm not being forced." His voice was steady, sincere. "I want to be with you. I want to be part of the future you're building." Aurora inhaled softly. For the first time, she saw certainty in his eyes, not because of duty, not because of family pressure, but because of her. She didn't answer right away. A part of her had spent months preparing for the day Ethan would leave, return to the world he was meant for. But now, standing before her, he was no longer the same reckless heir from New York. He was a man who had truly changed. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice quiet but piercing. Ethan squeezed her hands gently. "More sure than I've ever been about anything." And in that moment, Aurora knew she had fallen for him too. A slow smile spread across her lips, revealing a softness she had always kept hidden. "Then I suppose you can stay." Ethan didn't hesitate. He pulled her into a kiss, one that was no longer restrained, no longer burdened by the past. It was a kiss that sealed everything they had endured and everything they had become. And in that kiss, Aurora finally admitted the truth. "These past 6 months, I've liked you too." That night, in the heart of the windswept fields, beneath a sky full of quiet stars, they gave in to everything they had been holding back. They became one, not out of obligation, but out of choice. The Texas morning was clearer than ever. The soft golden light stretched across fields of ripening wheat, and Ethan Walker knew this was home. Last night's proposal wasn't just a moment, it was a turning point. No contracts, no obligations, just him and Aurora, choosing each other. There was no need for grand declarations anymore, because now, action spoke louder than words. Ethan continued working at Sullivan Agritech, not as an outsider, but as someone who truly cared. He woke up early to check irrigation systems, listened intently as experts discussed ways to improve soil conditions, and even tested solutions himself in the fields. For the first time in his life, he wasn't Ethan Walker, heir to a financial empire. He was simply a man who had found something worth working for. They decided on a small wedding, not for business, not for their families, but because they truly wanted to be together. No grand cathedral, no distant relatives, just them and the people who had walked this journey with them. Aurora wore a simple white dress, her soft curls swaying gently in the wind. Ethan looked at her, and this time there was no hesitation. "The first time I married you, it was out of obligation," he murmured, squeezing her hand. "But this time, I'm marrying you because I can't imagine my life without you." Aurora smiled, softer than the sunset behind them. She had once doubted him, but now she doubted nothing at all. As the last rays of sunlight kissed the horizon, Ethan tightened his grip on her hand, feeling the warmth of the woman who was once just a contract on paper. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find what truly matters. Aurora rested her head against his shoulder, whispering, "And I think we just found it." Under the endless Texas sky, a new life began. No longer forced, no longer bound by contracts, only love.